What I'd like to do is turn the program over to a gentleman that has done these seminars with us as a partner in there around the Commonwealth. Trip Pollard, who's a senior attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center, and is very familiar with Virginia, has been a strong advocate for environmental policies throughout the Commonwealth, worked with the General Assembly on a variety of issues. In his presentation today, he'll be talking about development issues, which is one of his specialties. But the interesting thing about it, normally you think about environmentalists and developers being on the opposite side of the table. In this presentation, you'll hear some strange things from a strong environmentalist, is that he's advocating for strong development policies as well. So I would turn it over to this time to Trip Pollard.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. And it's great to be here with you all this morning. I talked to several of you before, and I love getting down to this part of Virginia. I live in Richmond and have a lot of friends and spend as much time as I can down here. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. And as Neil mentioned, I work with the Southern Environmental Center. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan group. We work in 6 states in the South. Our headquarters is actually in Charlottesville. I work out of Richmond. And we work on a range of issues, air, water, pollution, things like that. Also, I'm the head of our what we call our land and community program. So I work on transportation and on land use issues, but also on a lot of other issues. As I think in the introductory remarks, Jimmy had a great point about the need to think beyond silos. I've done a lot of work, for example, on affordable housing because of the inextricable links that I've seen between housing, transportation, land use, what our communities are like, what's our quality of life. I think all of these are inextricably bound up. And I think that, as Neil mentioned, I do a lot of work at the state level on policy issues. I think one of the problems that we have and that has exacerbated the ability to address the challenges we have is the fact that we do still tend to think in terms of state agencies, in terms of legislation, in terms of programs, in terms of the silos. And I think that's made it much more difficult to address a lot of the problems that we all see on the ground, that we all experience every day. Given the fact that I do work on a lot of times trying to see how these different issues fit together, Housing Virginia asked me several years ago to put together a study which is available over here on the table that looks at the links between transportation, housing, and land use. So Neil just gave you a number of statistics and information that's kind of particularly on the ground relevant to counties here. I'm going to take a little bit of a broader look statewide at some of the issues and trends. We'll reinforce and mention some of the statistics that Neil mentioned, but also hopefully help to tee up some of the discussion for our local experts who are really going to get into how some of these issues are playing out and some things on the ground here. The other thing, in addition to talking about some trends that I want to talk a little bit about, are also some solutions and some areas of both policy changes in particular, but also ways that we can begin to address the challenges we see in transportation, housing, and land use as well. And caveat before I get into any of that is, this is a state study. I'm going to talk about some pretty broad themes at times. Totally recognize the fact that some of the things I'm going to talk about will not be necessarily appropriate for your particular community. I mean, these all need to be very much localized, but the themes, the issues are very consistent that I see throughout work I do in Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, rural, Southwest Virginia, and here as well. I think there's a lot of the themes are very consistent, but clearly they need to all be tailored very much to a local solutions. So this is the report that I wrote a couple of years ago looking at the jobs, transportation, affordable housing. And it's available both here, but it's also, if you'd like to pass on to other folks, it's on the website, both our website, which is southernenvironment.org, but also on Housing Virginia's website, housingvirginia.org. So just a little bit on the affordability trends, and Neil touched on some of this. The thing, again, taking that kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture here, statewide, over 35% of all households are cost burdened. Again, that's spending 30% or more of your household income on housing. That translates into over 1 million Virginians. And that is an enormous amount of our population. Clearly, and we'll get into, I won't go into as much of the specific data on some of these as Neil did, but some good points came out about how some data can be skewed. You know, you need to always ask those good questions. Anyone who knows and works with this stuff, data can be messed around, but, and you can miss some of the nuances of it. But over a third of our people being cost burdened, there are clearly some nuances to that, but it's a fundamental starting point when we talk about, as we also heard in the introductory remarks, the housing being an absolute cornerstone, fundamental need, and I want to use that line about the caveman in the future. We've got, we clearly have serious issues here, which is not news under any of you who are working on these, but you'd be surprised at how often state, and I do at the federal level as well, policymakers really don't get how ongoing and how widespread this issue is. And I would say, despite the fact that some of the median sale prices, sale prices overall have declined every now and starting to tick back up in other places, the challenges are as great, if not greater than ever. And I get this a number of times in talking to policymakers. They say, well, why do you say affordable housing is an issue? Housing prices have come down so far. Isn't housing much more affordable? Hasn't that problem gone away? And I think that's, obviously, to those of you who work in this area know that is completely off base, but you'd be surprised at how prevalent that view is, certainly I find among state and federal decision makers. There are obviously, even as we saw the housing prices begin to decline, we actually saw an increase in the total percentage of people who are cost burdened. Neil mentioned a number of the factors, everything from incomes being flat. There's also obviously the big challenges of, even if the housing is more affordable, trying to get loans and all that. So I think it's really important to start with that baseline, but again, to be aware how big a challenge it is. Sometimes people understand how serious that challenge is and that it remains. Statewide, it takes over 20% of typical household income to afford a typical home. Now that's below the 30% level. It's lower than it has been a bit, but that is still awfully high. In this area, you mentioned the breakdown, I won't dwell on that, but still most localities do see very high percentage of cost burden, and especially in the rental area. And again, no surprise, the problem is much more serious for the lower income households. Problems obviously aren't uniform throughout the Commonwealth. Those are some statewide data. This is just to give you one quick snapshot that looks at, this is also from the source book that Neil mentioned, which I want to also put a plug in for. It's a great source of information. And you can see how, in this area, we have some particular challenges. Some of the areas where we have to have a highest percent of household income required for overall housing affordability are actually highest. Now, there are some reasons that skew some of the data, for example, for Lancaster, we talked about. But nonetheless, overall, you see the challenges here. But I do think that the importance of localizing this is very important. Obviously, it differs between counties, and it differs greatly even within areas within counties. Taking an even bigger step back, it also, we have to look at the relation between income and housing affordability. This is a national study that came out this year and concluded that not in a single state can a minimum wage worker afford a two-bedroom unit at fair market rent, working, say, 40 hours a week. And you can see that Virginia actually is one of the worse states in terms of affordability, the amount of hours you would have to work at minimum wage to afford a two-bedroom unit. Again, statewide, but give you a sense of the challenge. And this is some statewide data that, again, looks at trying to break down and look at these numbers in some different ways and think about what it means, are the fact that a number of professions in particular, with the average income in those professions, it's not sufficient to afford housing in many areas of the country. So, real quick on housing, switch a little bit to the transportation. One way to address higher housing costs and affordable housing challenges has been the drive to qualify mentality. Let's go a little farther out, which can find you cheaper housing, but often greatly increases transportation costs. And transportation, in fact, is the second largest household expenditure typically behind housing. And the transportation costs, Neil mentioned how in Virginia, pretty much across the board, and certainly in this region, in every single county, you have the percentage of the commuting expense is above what is considered typical affordable level. There are a whole lot of reasons for this. Some of it is geography in certain areas, some of it's history, some of it's the mismatch that's gotten worse in many places between jobs and housing, where the jobs are located, where much of the affordable housing is located, and the lack of transportation to get from one place to another. So it drives up the cost of transportation, but it also makes access much more difficult. So that's why we think it's so important to look at housing and transportation combined. And I'm really glad to see that Housing Virginia recently, in the latest edition of the source book, has added this data in, which is, again, I commend you to take a look at this. Because I think too often, in terms of thinking about affordable housing, we've just looked at the cost of housing, and you really need to look at the transportation and housing combined. You really need to think about affordable communities rather than affordable housing. When you look at some of the areas and you add transportation costs, it does change the picture. And it changes it not only county, but it can change it within an area. And one way to look and think and dramatize about this, and I want to get beyond to some of the county level statistics. This is an example from the Richmond region. It really shows this well. This is, if you just look at housing costs, the darker blue areas are where it's 30% and greater. So you have the higher housing here, and then so you would think that the way often it is, you have some of the cheaper housing in the center of a corridor region, more affordable often. You drive farther out to the fringes. You drive to qualify. If you add transportation to this, and look at this in the same region, it's a very different picture. Suddenly, all those outlying housing areas aren't as affordable. They take a much higher percentage of income. So that's why, again, it's really important to look at and think about housing and transportation combined. Also, unfortunately, we tend to put so much of our money into transportation, we make these access issues much more difficult. So we'll look at this in a moment. Quite literally, in many, many places in Virginia, you take your life in your own hands if you do anything other than drive to get from one place to another. So as we become decentralized, I mentioned a little bit the jobs housing mismatch. Clearly, there are different dynamics in different areas, but there is this overall has been greater decentralization. And one of the biggest impacts of this has been that many of the jobs, particularly created in some of the suburban areas, that might be the jobs most suited to lower income individuals, are inaccessible physically. And that disconnect, as we spread farther apart, as we have not provided many transportation alternatives, the lion's share of our tax dollars still goes year after year to highways and roads. It's led to some of these longer commutes and the higher transportation costs. And in fact, Virginia has the highest rate in the entire country of individuals who commute beyond the county residents. Clearly, that also drives up cost and congestion. When you add all that up, just again, taking a little step back, looking at this, over 82 billion miles are traveled in Virginia every year. That's farther than driving to the sun and back every single day in Virginia. So an enormous amount of driving. And when we look at this area here, you mentioned the commuting costs. There's a very high rate of commuting here, a very high rate, as not news to you, without commuting beyond the locality in this region. And if you look at the 12 kind of counties that in and around here, is about 8 million miles are driven every single day in those 12 counties. I mentioned access. This is the other kind of difficult part of the equation is, as we spread out further, as we haven't provided many of these alternative means of transportation, it's difficult to get to the jobs. Again, this is the Richmond region because we've done some work with this group to map out some of this, but I don't know how well you can see, but basically it's showing these are where some of the jobs are that are more entry-level jobs, and the areas where the housing affordability issues, low income issues are more center of the region. And you see this hash here is the transit system. So in the Richmond region, for example, which is fairly typical of many places in Virginia, you have no way other than a car to get to any of the jobs in the region where some of the fastest job creation, and especially the entry-level jobs, are being created. There's no way for lower income individuals in most of the region to get to those jobs. I want to say a little bit about demographic trends. That's kind of an overlay on all of this. It's going to really both create greater challenges, but also create some real opportunities, I think, to address some of these challenges that I mentioned. Because there are a whole lot of demographic changes really changing I think a lot of things in Virginia, in certainly in this region. The population increase overall, I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, which is projected to continue. Some of the redistribution is occurring between different areas, cities, suburban, rural areas. The aging population, which was mentioned earlier, and I had not heard that statistic about Gloucester. That's really a very, very high percentage, even more than I would have guessed for here. And then changing household composition. Let me say a little bit more about each of those. Population growth overall, statewide, Virginia has been on a rather continual, rather rapid, outgrowing the national rate of population growth for quite a while, and that is projected to continue for the foreseeable future. Again, that's not evenly distributed. This looks at a 15-year slice at where the growth has been highest. Mainly it's been in the urban crescent, Northern Virginia, down to Richmond, to Hampton Roads, with some other areas that have been growing. The darker is the highest rate of population growth on a percentage basis, but you can see this area has grown quite a bit as well. And looking at this 12-county area, it's been growing more rapidly than the state or the national average in terms of percentage increase in population. You can see the numbers and the percentage of rate. So it is continuing to see and projected to see much higher than average population growth for this region. And an aging population. This is statewide. You see the acceleration predicted for population 65 and older. And clearly there are very different housing transportation needs for an aging population. In terms of, I mentioned that the strong desire, as Pollard showed, to age in place, to live in your community. Much of our housing stock doesn't fit that very well. A lot of it's built on a model that assumes that you can drive everywhere. And the other thing that's changing is the household composition. By 2000, only a little over half of all households were married couples. Non-family households were a third of all households in Virginia by 2010. So we see real changes in the household composition, household size. At the same time, most of our housing stock has been built around sort of the Ozzie and Harriet model of the 1950s of a married couple with children. That's no longer the norm. And our housing stock has lagged, catching up to that as a transportation system. So that's a real quick look at some of the big picture trends, some of the issues that tease up. Host of impacts and things follow from this. I'll touch on a few just very briefly. One of the things that's finally catching the attention of some of the state level decision makers of our housing and transportation trends is the cost. The higher infrastructure cost. And what this means, clearly we see this at the local level, we see it at the state level. The high cost of taxpayers to serve newer development, especially as it's more scattered, as it spreads farther out. And the cost of congestion. I mentioned the increase in the cost of commute, and much of that is the cost of congestion, and the higher cost, as I mentioned, that you often see as you move farther out, driving up the household transportation costs. One study that really dramatizes this pretty well for more of a rural area that I've seen, looking at the infrastructure costs and the burden of alternative development patterns. This was done a few years ago, looking at the eastern part of Alamo County, but mainly at Louisa and Fluvanna County and a little bit of Greene, looking at two different scenarios, assuming the exact same amount of population growth. They're growing very rapidly, just like this area is, largely rural still area, and under the projected population growth on a business as usual scenario, projected they need to spend about $1 billion in roads, not assuming much for transit at all, and you'd still end up with about 44% of miles being congested. Under a more town neighborhood model type development that is more like the way we did most of our building pre-World War II, again, not exclusively, but putting more population, again, same population, same number of jobs, would cut that amount of infrastructure need in half. And at the same time, reduce the amount you need to drive and the amount of congestion you see. So again, a good way of thinking about it, looking at those inextricable links between housing, transportation, and in this case, also looking at the cost of taxpayers, the fiscal impacts. Economic impacts as well. Obviously, lack of affordable housing has tremendous impacts on the households, which we mainly talked about, but it also hurts a region and an area's economic competitiveness. This is something that's increasingly becoming recognized in the competition for, as we have a more mobile economy, trying to attract and retain employees. That business leaders are recognizing the need to pay more attention to issues like affordable housing, land use, transportation that didn't used to be high on the radar screen. And then the energy impacts. We burn a whole lot of energy driving all those miles. Over 5 billion gallons consumed in Virginia annually. And this is just a quick look statewide at energy use, just to show you transportation actually consumes more of our energy than any other sector. And a lot of environmental impacts. As we spread further apart, as we drive more, really almost every single major environmental challenge facing this region, facing the Commonwealth, is linked pretty directly to our transportation and our land use patterns. Health impacts as well. To power those homes, the emissions from vehicles and power plants. As you see, the average 112 violations of health standards statewide each year. And the social impacts. Obviously, a huge range of challenges. We mentioned the ability to age in place, for example, but also I mentioned people being priced out of the communities. It makes it very difficult sometimes to have essential employees like police, firefighters, teachers live where they work. Increased time we spend commuting is much less time for our families and communities. And as I mentioned, also the access to be able to get to job opportunities. Those are just some of the many, many aspects, as well as impacting economic and racial diversity. So that's just a very quick summary, looking at a lot of the trends, a lot of the challenges that we face, and some of the impacts and consequences of those. I'd like to shift now and look at an alternative approach that we're seeing. As Neil mentioned at the beginning, I do a lot of work with development community, which you are sometimes very surprised to hear environmentalists say that they do. But I really think that the answer to almost all the problems I've described is development. Not no development, it's development. But we've got to be more intelligent about the type of development that we make easiest to build through our regulations, that we provide incentives for, that we think through much more and be more cognizant about some of the impacts I mentioned and build a case to move towards more inclusive development, providing more affordable housing, lower cost to taxpayers, better access to jobs. Basically go down the list, the opposite of many of the problems we're currently experiencing. I think shifting our land use transportation patterns is how we're going to get there. And there are a whole lot of opportunities for change. I mean, that's the good news after some of the gloom and doom and some of the statistics I mentioned, is many of these patterns are in no way inevitable. They're a fairly predictable result of our current policies. Our current policies have made it typically, in most areas of Virginia, cheapest and easiest to build scattered, single-use development. A good friend of mine who's a developer, for example, had a piece of property and wanted to build more of a neighborhood community. It was illegal under the zoning laws to build houses anywhere next to each other. They had to be set back a certain distance from the street. You know, you go down the list of a lot of regulations that maybe make sense in and of themselves, but you put them together and it leads to a product that doesn't match very well the needs of our society today. He didn't give up, thankfully, and could afford to keep pushing to get at least some of what he wanted. It took him 3 years to get his project approved, and it only halfway resembled what he wanted to get. And he said, had I just done a cookie-cutter subdivision, I could have gotten it approved in about 3 weeks. So, you know, this is the type of unintentional system we've tended to put together, and that's why I think that there are so many opportunities to change course. The other benefit is that these steps are often complementary. Things you do to improve, for example, transportation, to give people more choices of their transportation, lower their costs, help make communities more affordable, also help lower pollution, increase the health costs, address the health costs. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunities for synergism and promise for change. So I'm going to just give very briefly an overview of some of the major areas, some of the ways that recommendations contained in the report to look at ways to think about changing some of these long-term patterns. Again, need to be very much adapted to local situation. But one of the biggest is to promote more compact walkable development. I mentioned some of the regulatory barriers that are there now, minimum lot and house size, setback, parking. But it's also a matter of providing some incentives to developers, not just allowing them to build more neighborhood, traditional town-type development, but it's giving incentives for some of the things you want, like density bonuses or reducing impact fees if your locality has that, or expediting approval. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that all development should be neighborhood, town-centered. But right now, we have overbuilt for one model of development, and we've really underbuilt and made it almost impossible to build the other type. And so it's not that you have to build all development this way, so don't misunderstand that. Sometimes when I talk to legislators, they say, we just want everyone to live in a city. Well, that's not the point. It's more to make it possible to live in neighborhood communities, town centers, if that's what you want. And that's certainly what the market is showing us that a whole lot of people want and they can't find. And paired with that is to promote living closer to your work. Again, mixed-use development, but also things like allowing live-work units, which many localities don't allow. Providing grants to employees, for example. And there's a role here where employers, there's private-public partnerships can go hand in hand here, purchase homes near work. One of the biggest changes is to put more of a premium on renovation, infill development, redeveloping the housing stock we already have, where we already have paid for the infrastructure, water, sewer, roads to serve this. Again, we tend to make it cheapest and easiest to do the exact opposite. So looking at zoning mandates, at the state level, we're terrible about this. The lion's share of our money goes to highways that open up, or roads that open up new areas to development, rather than maintaining the roads we do have that get filled with potholes and people say, well, I don't want to live there anymore. That's around my neighborhood. We need to direct more of our tax dollars that we're already spending to our existing communities. Give just an example of infill just to show the potential, because clearly we're going to have population growth continuing, as I mentioned. We certainly hope we're going to have economic growth continuing. So that's why, again, I am absolutely not a no-growth person, but we've got to have more sensible growth. And one huge opportunity are some of the development decisions that we made in the 60s and 70s particular, when we were growing out very rapidly in some of our communities. Gas was cheap, and you ended up with some models of retail that maybe made sense for the time that have since been eclipsed. And we have a lot of underused or vacant shopping centers and the like. So this is just a visualization to give an example of how, through incentives, regulatory changes, you could convert something like this. You begin to allow multi-story, denser development, allow residential as well as commercial to be mixed, bring it in, narrow the streets, make it more pedestrian friendly. And here's before and after revitalization. For example, historic tax credits are something that a lot of localities and certainly the state has used to promote revitalization. Again, making it more attractive to have the type of development that is much more beneficial. Another example of revitalization. And then trying to guide some more of our growth, again, not mandate, but encourage growth in particular targeted areas and more mixed income development within those areas. Again, one of the best tools for that is using state and local and federal funding, using the power of the purse and the tax dollars we do spend to incentivize the development. And promoting development that is more transit accessible. So where you have transit, that means giving the incentive for development, and also it means putting more of your transportation dollars in those areas. Another area for potential policy shifts is promoting greener building. And this is not just an environmental pitch here. It's about making healthier buildings and more energy efficient is really one of the most important things. When you look again, this is where, again, think of the silo mentality. We've missed a lot of challenges and we've missed a lot of our solutions here. The average American household spends about 5% of their income on energy, while low-income households spend about 16%. So energy is an enormous component of affordability that isn't factored into quite a few of our measures when we look at housing stock, we look at affordable housing. The energy really we need to take into account. And state and local level, there's a whole host of things you can do to begin to make more efficient, healthier housing, from technical assistance to grants to permitting and the like. You can't have the link for that transportation land use without changing the transportation funding. Again, right now we spend 85–90% typically of our tax dollars on one single mode, that's driving. Again, solutions vary, and so what we need to have more transit, be it established surfaces or maybe demand responsive is more appropriate for certain communities. Pedestrian, bike, walkability, and sometimes it's just minor steps like providing bus shelters. The big shift in the thinking is to reprogram some of this money that right now a lot of it's stuck in a silo and can only go one way. And to think more broadly about a transportation system that works for people, not just moving cars as fast as possible from point A to point B. And then advancing housing affordability. Every single thing that I've mentioned so far, if done properly, will help make communities more affordable. Mixed income communities, lower lot sizes, use the alternative of live work units, granny flats, there are a whole host of things that can help drive down the cost of housing. But on top of that, there should be some additional steps that particularly help benefit housing affordability, like reducing zoning limits on multifamily units and accessory dwellings, like granny flats, a house out back. And again, providing incentives to encourage below market housing units. And then a number of communities are now looking at, and certainly statewide, trying to establish affordable housing, greater pots of money just direct. So those are just some of the overall policy directions. I know about some of the things that are being done in this community already. Throughout Virginia, we're seeing steps along these lines. I think that there's enormous desire to do things differently. I think there's enormous potential. I showed a moment ago the slides about the reconverting a shopping center. I mean, I think that one of the most important things is to just realize that we have choices about many of these trends and how we're going to address these trends. And so I find visualization and thinking through really helps me to understand some of these choices and how we can change things. And again, looking at an opportunity for revitalization and infill. This is in Richmond, and just looking at with some changes in zoning code and encouraging incentivized development, steering more of that population to areas that can be served by transit, have more affordable housing, and more walkable communities, and better for taxpayers, build that fiscal base. And in a more suburban kind of setting, adding some density, not huge density, narrowing streets, making them more pedestrian and bicycle friendly. But the bottom line is about, in all these changes, trying to make more affordable housing, increasing job access, making these connections between transportation and land use. And these are really the bottom line where we've got to get in all of this as we think about and evaluate particular policies and programs, is to provide a greater range of housing choices, types of housing, price points of housing, reducing that burden of housing and transportation costs, making it easier to live near work and to access jobs whether you have a car or not. And the final analysis is all about people. And thank you all so much for coming here today, for all that you do. These are not easy issues. They are very challenging, but also very obviously significant and rewarding. And I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you all for all that you do. And I'm glad to answer some questions, and also very much look forward to hearing from our local experts about these issues. Thanks. Any questions at this point?
Sure, I got a couple questions.
Sure.
When I look at the models that you're talking about in terms of concentrating housing, there are a lot of problems in the rural communities. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how that applies in these counties. I mean, Gloucester County may be an outlier because they're facing a commute situation to urban areas that we're not facing in the more rural counties that are probably represented here. I'm not sure that building concentrated housing is a viable alternative in the rural communities, because a lot of that's you need central sewer for, because the problem is getting the mass drainfill approvals and those types of things. The jobs are scattered, so they're more shotgun approach in terms of commute patterns than going to an urban center. And I'm just trying to think through, you know, and we don't have the political will in these counties to approve concentrated housing, because we look at it as an urban phenomenon that we don't want in the rural setting. I'm trying to think if you've got any good examples for how we address some of these affordable issues and transportation issues in a rural county that are of a different model, maybe.
Right. Well, I think there are several things. I mean, one is that in almost every county, at least that I know of around here, and I don't know all of them as well, I mean, there are some centers of activity that have either historically or naturally grown up over time. And I hear you, especially your last comment about the local political will. It is challenging, but there are areas in every county that, again, either historically or grown up over time, where there is a greater concentration, and I think more can be done to help guide some of the road money, the sewer money there. I'm in no way saying, that's what I've kind of stressed a number of times, that these weren't across-the-board solutions. You're not going to see an urban, large area in most of the counties in this region. I'm well aware of that. So, but you do have areas that can be retrofit or infilled if the incentives are there And I think that is, what I would say is a step one, is to make that more of a priority, to make those centers as vibrant as you can. They will not handle all the growth that's coming. It's not that's pretty cool, the type of some of the population growth that you're seeing here is the other thing to take into account. As I said, there are a lot of nuances here.
Yeah.
And that's why I just wanted to tee up some of these issues for just this type of discussion of what makes the most sense here. Because there are a lot of nuances. You don't have necessarily the same percentage or types of population moving here that you're seeing in other parts of Virginia. So they're not necessarily looking for the exact same types of housing. So having said that, I do think there are opportunities in areas, the historic areas, more nodes at transportation crossroads. That's where you do tend in more rural areas who are resistant to grandiose or anything that smacks of master planning. They certainly get and recognize backups at intersections, transportation nodes, and they want to capitalize on the tax value of those areas because that's often their most marketable parcels. So I think that what I've seen some counties do is start small. So looking at, pick a historic area you want to revitalize, because everyone gets that, and work on that and work on either replicating that in another area. And again, typically it's where there's major transportation crossroads. So some developers have been willing to take this on. It's challenging, as you know, both with the market and with the local governments, but to try to have, even if it's on a more modest scale, a more compact development. I'm not talking, huge number of dwelling units per acre, but more compact than we've seen in this region in the past. Thinking about things like conservation subdivisions, where you still have the same number of residences, but you have them closer together, and there's more open spaces either put under easement. So you have the amenities that many of the people moving to this region might be looking for in terms of the nature, the views, without having quite as much sprawl. It's an interim kind of step. It's not ideal, but I think that absolutely you have to take into account the market that you're dealt with, the political situation that you're dealing with. But I think those are some of the kind of smaller steps you can take together.
Yes, trying to ask. You mentioned the amount of money that goes into transportation versus roads, and of course that's been an age-old concern for those of us who are transit dependent. And just global level, you mentioned talking to legislators. Have you ever seen anything? I mean, I wish every legislator would see the presentation and see the value, but is there any way we can convince legislators of the value of investing in transportation?
Yes, there's, I guess, two questions in that. One is, can you convince them of the value of investing in transportation overall, and then investing in maybe a different model of transportation? Again, for the foreseeable future, I mean, driving is going to be the dominant mode of transportation. And again, I'm not saying we don't put a fair amount of money into roads, but we need to spend the money we spend on roads, spend it more on existing communities, and then spend a higher percentage on transit and other choices. In terms of how you, as most of you are probably aware, transportation has been an incredibly hot issue in the General Assembly for the last 8-9 sessions in a row. We've had 2 special sessions. We've gone overtime at least twice over transportation. It's been probably the most contentious issue in the General Assembly of the last decade, other than like one-time contentious issues that obviously we all know about and reading the headlines. But in terms of just governmental, getting the job of government done, I think transportation probably has been the toughest and the most difficult. And we've come up with several packages during that time that have been kind of band-aids on the problem. The problem is that, well, there are many problems. It's a very complex issue. You have different parts of the state, obviously, with very, very different needs. Everyone doesn't want to be subsidizing anyone else. Everyone feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. And the other problem is that even as we've put some money into transportation additionally, or cobbled some additional money together from elsewhere, it's tended to be, we've blown most of it on still using an older model. Just to give you an example, I don't know what you all think about the pros or cons of it, but there's a proposal to build a new 460. We have an existing 460 that's one of the most likely used interstate or highways in the state. That proposal would take $1.4 billion of tax money. It would use all of the remaining money that the General Assembly approved and borrowed 2 years ago, and what at that time was one of the highest infusions of cash we've ever had. But we're going to spend it all on one highway in one place. And so that's what means so many of our communities get nothing. I mean, the localities, especially in this region, I mean, the primary and secondary road funding has been almost non-existent now. And really, one of the biggest problems is we've been spending a whole lot of money on a handful of big picture projects. And that's fundamentally what I think is where we've gotten off track some. In terms of changing people's thoughts, I mean, so now we're at a point where 2 years ago, I think we've maxed out on what we can borrow. Where do we go? Well, the last session, the General Assembly tried to go for general funds. Well, that means our money for housing, our money for education, our money for police. I mean, we're really going to get in trouble, I think. This is not now part of the kind of housing, but I mean, I think it's because I think these are inextricably linked. You can't starve education and housing to try to pay for more roads. I think that is a fundamental mistake. I think, as we said at the very, very beginning, I think education is one of the absolute linchpins of how we're going to have economic development, how we're going to move forward as a Commonwealth. But that was on the table last session, a pretty significant rate on the general fund, and my guess is it'll be back again in January because they run out of other options other than taxes and tolls. So tolls, we've already seen start to increase. Northern Virginia has coming online pretty soon with the Beltway has these new called hot lanes, where in what used to be the HOV or high occupancy vehicle lane, there's an additional lane that's now HOT or high occupancy toll lane, so you can ride it if you pay more. Everyone's familiar with the Midtown Downtown Tunnel, I'm sure. And that deal and what that's going to mean in terms of the tolls that are going to have to be paid and the concerns of what that's going to mean for job access, low-income individuals, what it's going to mean for the housing market. I mean, again, all of these are interrelated, and I think the fallout from that is going to be pretty significant. Their proposed new 460 would have a tolling component in addition to the $1.1 billion of tax money we're looking at. So, you know, I think tolling is here, and then taxing is the other issue that's on the table. That right now is very much gridlock between them. So we'll see. The parties, there is a lot of discussion about some kind of a compromise package. I don't know whether it'll go forward this year, but I would encourage you to talk to your legislators, because part of the problem is they don't ever hear about these things other than a generalized, we need more money for transportation kind of thing. So I think that there's a lot of education to be done. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of people, decision-makers, for example, think we don't have a great affordable housing crisis. Well, there's not a lot of awareness of these issues of the links between housing, transportation, affordability. So I think it's really important to talk to your legislators to help to educate them. Because I do think that we've made some progress on some of these issues, and I do think that there's a real common ground available on some of this, but there's a big need for education, and there's a big need for the public to get involved in these issues.
I was just going to say, I'm not crying because of your answer, I'm just straight.
I just wanted to make a comment. Kathy had mentioned earlier about the aging population
Yes.
here. And I think if you are looking at any kind of development that's retrofitting, that keeping in mind accessibility and
Absolutely.
visibility, as you do that, I think to get to your point about the demand in these rural areas, if there were more accessible housing, since people are unable to return to their homes in these rural environments where people want to stay,
That's right.
I think there would be a
I think that's right, and again, that, it gets back to what I was saying about where do you put these and how do you get these in certain counties. I do think it's got to be maybe more of a piecemeal approach, but I think it's some of the existing areas, but I think that the need for housing for an aging population is going to be one of the things that makes people think more openly about more mixed use in at least certain areas. And that we've got to provide the ability for an older generation to get around, to get to what they need. And that's why I was saying the demographics, I think, are going to complicate some of the things, but I think they're going to also make some things give some momentum for change. I think an aging population is one of the best arguments that decision makers are going to find it increasingly hard to ignore of why they have to allow in some areas some more neighborhood walkable type development.